Why are people so obsessed with UFOs? Today, I have the privilege of speaking with Professor Eghigian, a historian at Penn State University, whose work explores the history of conspiracy theories, paranormal belief, and humanity's fascination with the unexplained. In today's conversation, we'll explore why UFOs became such a powerful cultural phenomenon, how conspiracy theories shape public thinking, and what that history of the unexplained reveals about human nature and our society. Professor Eghigian, thank you so much for joining me.
Sure, happy to be here with you.
To start, what first inspired you to begin studying UFOs and paranormal belief from a historical perspective?
Well, I was always really interested in this stuff. When I was your age, I really read a lot about that stuff, but my interest in it sort of waned as I got older. Just really got interested in a lot of other things. That was the main reason why. But I was thinking about the subject when a colleague of mine was working on another project about kind of a revival of the supernatural after World War II. And I was kind of sort of inclined to sort of look into this interest that I had had when I was younger and thought, hey, what was that all about? And were other countries besides the United States really interested in it? And I started doing some digging, and it sort of led me to sort of read some newspapers from the time. And sure enough, I saw like different countries talking about having these same kind of conversations that were going on in the United States. And I thought, wow, I bet you a lot of historians have written about this. And then I found out that no, in fact, very few had written about it, and no major book had been written about it in decades. And that's when I thought, this is the kind of thing that we historians should be doing, like studying human fascination with all sorts of things, but particularly things that people don't understand or feel confused by or trepidatious about. And then I decided to dive in and write a book about it.
And I think that's really interesting when you're talking about things that people are confused by. Because when most people think about UFOs, they either treat them as A, completely ridiculous, or B, unquestionably real. What does that polarization tell us about modern society?
Yeah, you're right. It is really polarized. And what that tells me is that the fact that UFOs really precipitate so much passion and fervency on both sides tells me that the conversation about UFOs isn't really just about UFOs. That oftentimes, as I like to say, when people are having a conversation, or mostly when they're having a debate about UFOs and they're getting real riled up about it, that's almost a sure sign that they're really not just talking about UFOs. It's indicative of the fact that the conversation about UFOs is a conversation about all sorts of other things. Sometimes it's a conversation about, hey, can you believe people when they say things? Are people inherently sincere or authentic, or do people lie, or do people play jokes on people? Do we deceive ourselves about certain things, or can we be trusted when we say we've experienced something? But sometimes the conversation is more about belief. It's about things like, hey, I believe there's more to the world and the universe than appears to be the case. I believe in something much larger, much bigger than us, and maybe it's gods, or sometimes it's aliens, or some sort of intermediary beings. And other people whose attitude is, come on, get grounded. There's nothing more than this. This is reality, and that's all there is to it. So I think those are a lot of the times the kind of conversations that are going on in the background. They're the subtext that's going on that people aren't talking about. And that's, I think, why a lot of this polarization takes place.
And your work kind of talks about that. That an interesting idea that I found is that UFO phenomena often reflects deeper fears and anxieties within a society. And in your opinion, what kind of fears were people projecting onto UFOs during World War II or the Cold War, World War II, which you mentioned before?
Right. Sure. I mean, and there's no question about it. The UFO phenomenon, right? The whole fascination with this possibility of aliens visiting us is really something that only develops in the wake of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. And you can trace it really clearly in particularly those early years of the late 1940s and early 1950s, when people didn't know what's going on. There were all these weird sightings going on, and people are really confused about it. The government is saying, hey, there's nothing to see here, but people didn't believe it. And really what it kind of reflected was this sense of the world being out of control. That a lot of people suspected that these things that people were seeing were probably man-made, but they were probably by either the Soviet Union or the United States, and they weren't telling and being honest with people about it. And so there was this grave concern that, hey, look, this is something we've been experiencing the last few years. You know, during World War II, countries came up with new kinds of weapons and used them on citizens in brutal ways. Probably the most obvious one and the most lethal one was the atomic bomb. And so that kind of logic sort of was really there, sort of built into and baked into the UFO phenomenon at the start. I will say, though, one other thing is that UFOs also have historically sparked a lot of enthusiasm. It's the flip side of this, is that at the same time, a lot of people from the very beginning were really excited about, and I still meet people today who say it would be the greatest thing in the world if these things really are alien visitors. It would be awesome. And I think there's a lot of people who see in them a lot of hope, a lot of promise, a lot of things to get excited about.
And I think when we look at the trend of UFO sightings or the UFO craze, we're talking about the 40s and 50s. Why do you think UFO sightings and conspiracy theories in general tend to increase during moments of political or social instability like the Cold War? Does it come from that rational fear of the new weapons, or is there a bit of irrationality in there as well?
Well, I think there is always a rationale and a logic to why certain kinds of ideas and attitudes develop. There has been for a long time, basically since the birth of the modern state, has been a current that runs throughout some people in the public who have a deep either resentment toward government in the state or deep skepticism about government programs and things like that. But you're right, this idea of this evolving sense of conspiracy, that there's all these different entities, some governmental, some academic, some private, right, companies, all these people are working together in cahoots behind the scenes and hiding things. That phenomenon also started right at the very beginning of the UFO phenomenon. And your question is about, the extent to which this stuff kind of emerges and gets intensified during social crises or political crises. And that's, I think, in large measure true. And I think one of the main reasons for that is that conspiracy thinking tends to be connected to individuals and groups of people thinking that things are not in their control. A sense that a lot of things are happening that are not good, that are scary, or have a potential to be scary. And they don't feel that they have any kind of say in that, any kind of power to influence those events. And when I think people feel that way, they turn to this idea that there must be a group of people out there who are the people who have control and who are running the show. And that tends to be a kind of, I guess you'd say, a kind of incubator for these kinds of ideas. And again, as long as people sort of feel this strong sense of insecurity, of powerlessness, I think that's a real fertile ground for these kinds of conspiracy theories.
And we talk about like the distrust in government. Do we see specific moments in U.S. history, potentially Watergate or some other scandal, that really influenced the growth of UFO conspiracy thinking?
I think we do. I think there's no question that you get the early versions of this conspiracy thinking emerges in the late 40s and 50s during the beginnings of the Cold War. And when, this is starting to play out and the stakes seem very, very high because, the use of atomic bombs is very fresh in people's memory of them. It's not ancient history. And another period we see is in the late 60s, but particularly the 1970s. And there too, you mentioned Watergate and the Watergate scandal of 72, 73, 74. But even before that was, of course, the Vietnam War played a big role in that. The general sense also that science and technology was kind of running amok, was running out of control. There were some major, for instance, medical technology scandals around that time that led to the development of new medical ethics. These kinds of things definitely help kind of trigger and accelerate a lot of this conspiracy theory that's going to really take hold over the course of the 1970s.
And why do you think people are so drawn to that idea that governments might be hiding secret knowledge from the public? Does it go back to what you were saying about kind of sense of assurance that like things are out of their control, or is there some other motivations as well in there?
Well, I think for one thing, we have to say it's because actually, what one thing conspiracy theorists are right about is governments do keep secrets, and they continue to keep secrets. But I think what feeds that is the fact that what we have is one of the things we forget historically is that, say, if we take the U.S. government as an example, if you were to look at the size of the U.S. government in even 1900, it's a small enterprise. It's not a large entity. 50 years later, by the time World War II has ended and you get the beginning of the flying saucer phenomenon, government is massive. It's huge. The military bureaucracy alone is astronomically large. There's all these moving parts. There's a whole world now of bureaucracy that a lot of people, even within the bureaucracy, aren't aware of and don't know what they're doing. You have then, because of the world wars and then followed by the Cold War, increasing classification of information, this idea that government should be in the business of not only securing resources, but that it should secure information from spreading to possible nefarious agents into the public. That those things are taking shape. And so conspiracy theory sort of wedges its way into that kind of world where we know darn well that governments do these things. Now, do governments go around keeping information for the sake of keeping people uninformed about aliens and alien visitors? That's very difficult to say, and it's certainly a difficult argument to be able to marshal a lot of evidence for. But there's no question about the fact that the kind of default setting that occupies a lot of branches of government, which is to say, let's keep information in-house. That kind of thing really does, in fact, I think, help feed people's worries and concerns about secrecy.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense because, I mean, even if we look at just the FBI, founded in like 1907, 1908, before that, they were like leasing contractors from outside of the government to do investigations. But then as we go closer and closer to the 1950s and 60s, kind of corresponding with the same timeline you were talking about, we see a consolidation of power within the FBI, for example, where they have their own departments, more increased funding. So I think that's a really interesting perspective.
Yeah.
No,
spot on.
And I think when we talk about now more modern day, the internet and social media have also changed the spread of conspiracy theories and other unexplained phenomena. How do you think that modern technology has transformed UFO culture specifically compared to our earlier decades?
Yeah, so the internet and social media, and then now more recently AI, have had a really big impact on the UFO world. One of the things has been the ready access to data and information that people can directly share with one another, right? One of the things that has had an impact on is UFO organizations. I've had lots of conversations with veteran ufologists who, were active back in the 1960s, some of them. And they talk about how once the internet came on board in the late 90s and early 2000s, it became difficult to actually have UFO organizations, for people to show up to meetings, for people to be interested in going to a UFO talk. Whereas they would have hundreds, now it was very hard to get even a dozen or a dozen and a half people to show up regularly. And I think that's because of this fact that people could now just simply go online and have virtual communities, right? But the other thing, of course, that's come with it is what I think we see in a lot of domains in terms of knowledge today, right? There was this promise, this hope that what the internet was going to do is democratize information. It was going to make information and knowledge available to everybody, and there's no censorship, there's no ability for anybody to control it. What we've learned, of course, in more recent years is what it is it's democratized misinformation and disinformation. The UFO world today it was back then, but it still is today even more so, is rife with hoaxes, rumor mongering, lots and lots of information being passed on secondhand, third hand, fourth hand without any kind of backing or evidence to support it. So it's become, for a lot of, I know, investigators, even more difficult than it was before to sort of separate the noise from the signal, to separate the genuine from the inauthentic. That's certainly true as we're starting to see with AI, which makes it even now more difficult to trust our visual evidence, right? Our photographs doctored, is film really film of actual events? These things have become more difficult.
I think that's really interesting when you're talking about backing and evidence, because when people discuss conspiracy theories today, I think as a society we're often really quick to dismiss them in their entirety because of that misinformation spread by social media. But historically speaking, why is it important to study these beliefs more seriously rather than simply just mocking them about the ones that do have backing and do have evidence?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as a historian, I believe it's always important to study the way in which human beings interact between one another in society, but also with the natural world. It reveals a lot about us. It tells us about the ways in which we've changed over time, maybe the ways in which we've started to maybe do some things better, but also maybe some of the ways that we have lost that may have themselves been better than the way we do things now. But what you learn through history is that people make choices along the way. That most historians, I think, believe, as I do, that the world as we have it, the way we understand ourselves and our world, is not something that had to happen the way it's happened. We could have done things differently. Choices are made along the way. And one of the things we study in history is what are those moments in history where things went one way and might have gone another way? And how has that had an impact? What are the consequences of that for us? And so I think studying something like UFOs or conspiracy theories or ghost hunting, or you could name a lot of things that a lot of, I think, maybe many natural scientists and even some of my colleagues would sit there and say, oh, this stuff isn't worthy of our interest because it doesn't count. It's nonsense. It's silly. I think that's a very misguided short-term view of things. I think it's through understanding the way human beings look at the world and try to make sense of the world, we learn a lot about ourselves.
Yeah, I align a lot of these conspiracy theory ideologies with the same as almost being a historian of religion. It's obviously different, but I mean, in the same kind of lens, you're exploring how humans are interacting with the world around them, whether it be through UFOs or whether it be through Jesus. It's the same idea of a belief system.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and and that's worthy of understanding. We want to know ourselves better, and this is the way we can understand ourselves better. Yeah.
And what do you think that younger audiences, especially people my age or maybe a bit older than me, actually misunderstand about the history of UFOs and conspiracy theories?
Well, I think what I would say about in a sense both, but it certainly is true. It really is true about both. But I often say, and this is something I say in my book in the introduction, is that UFOs don't make history. People make UFOs make history. And what I mean by that is that the things that you see, the things you hear, are not just given. They're not just, here's this thing that's out there in the world, or here's a movement that's out there, or here's an idea out there in the world, and it's sort of already made and like a cake or a pie. It's already baked. Somebody, and lots of people typically, made those things, did those things, made these things happen. So when you in fact hear about all sorts of things going on and an investigation into a UFO case, and here's some film footage of a UFO, or here's a theory or an idea that people are putting forward, remind yourself that you want to work backward. Who are the people involved who brought this to your view? How did you get access to this information or this film footage, right? Who's behind it? What's the context of it? Who created it? Who distributed it? Who are the people behind sort of promoting it, right? These are all questions you want to start to have to adopt, I think, what's always a really positive thing to do, which is a critical attitude. And a critical attitude doesn't mean a debunking attitude, an attitude in which you dismiss people. It's simply to say to yourself, I want to be able to be better informed about the context of all of these things. Then I am in a better position to make a decision for myself about the extent to which I'm going to place a lot of confidence in this information, or maybe start to maybe moderate some of that confidence I have. I think that's the important thing to do. So always keep that in mind.
Yeah, I think that it goes back to what you were saying earlier about choices. Every decision that leads you up to a point to reading an article about UFOs went through a series of choices to get there. And I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense, to go back and examine what those choices that people made were and how they got to them.
Yeah, I think that's what we often forget, is you don't think you've made a choice. And again, the way we're bombarded with social media, we don't think we're making choices. But every time, we click on a link, every time we go down some rabbit hole, we're making choices. And also, it should be clear, is people have made choices for us as well, right? They're trying to push us to make certain choices. A good, thoughtful person who really wants to better understand themselves and the world around them is going to start to sit there and back away sometimes, just sit there and ask themselves about the choices others have made for you, but then also, what are the choices that I'm making for myself?
Thank you. And if you had to give one final takeaway to younger audiences about fear and belief, what would it be?
Boy, about fear and belief, that's a tough one. And in the sense that there's a lot to be said on the subject, and a lot's been written on the subject. I guess the thing for me, it's really kind of what we've just been talking about.
Yeah.
It's to sit there and understand that you actually do have a lot of say and a lot of control that you can exercise, even in a world that feels overwhelming. And the reality is that we are all, and all people who've ever lived in history and will ever live, will always find themselves, right? Part of what I always think about, in my analogy, is always a stream. We're all stuck in the stream and the currents of history. There's no escaping that. So we're all going to be impinged upon and affected by various kinds of social factors and institutions and expectations, from everything from our friends and family to governments and companies. But within that framework, you have an enormous amount of an ability to be able to stand away from all of that at times and to reflect on the extent to which you can find ways to find beliefs and find ideas and thoughts and speculations that are going to speak to you, I think, that are fruitful, productive, ethical, moral. So it's always to keep in mind that you always have that ability to sort of step away and reflect.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.